So, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm so glad that you were able to make it and join us for this special NREA roundtable discussion. My name is Melissa Sadorf. I'm the immediate past president of the National Rural Education Association, and my co-host, Bill Chapman, who is the incoming president-elect, and then Devin Brennan, who is also here. She is our current board president for NREA. At NREA, we know that rural schools are more than just educational institutions. They're the backbone of our communities. And so we understand that the challenges that our schools face often go beyond academics, touching on social and policy issues that directly impact your students, their families, and the educators that serve in your school buildings. One such issue is the immigration and the role of ICE in some new policies, and those potentially have some far-reaching implications that school leaders are being asked to navigate, and it needs to be done with care and with clarity. So to help us unpack what is happening across the country and what it means for rural schools, I'm pleased to welcome Tara Thomas, who's the Government Affairs Manager for AASA, the School Superintendents Association. Tara is a recognized expert in education policy and advocacy and works closely with school leaders across the country to understand and respond to evolving federal policies. She brings valuable insights into how these policies are shaping the experience of students and families in rural communities, and she will share guidance on what school leaders need to know moving forward. Just some logistics. If you have questions, Tara really wants this to be an interactive conversation. So please feel free to either raise your digital hand and we'll make sure that we give you some space, or put your questions or comments into the chat, and we'll make sure, Bill and I are going to make sure that she's able to respond to those. We're going to start with the immigration policy discussion first. And then we will move, when we're done with that, to just a more general conversation around what's happening with the Department of Education after the news this past few days. So, Tara, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to just get right into it because I know we have a lot to discuss. Let me share my screen. All right, is it full screen? We're good? Okay, great. So, like Melissa said, I'm here to talk about kind of some of the immigration policy changes and what's been happening, and then happy also if we have time to talk more broadly about the federal government and kind of everything else that's going on when it comes to education. Before I get started, I do want to start with a disclaimer, which I never thought I would have to do, but as much as I like to pretend like I am a lawyer, I am not. And this presentation should not be misconstrued as any type of legal guidance. It's for informational purposes only. As always, you should check with your legal counsel and the people in your districts. Additionally, AASA does not, we, as you all know, feel strongly about the principle of local control. We know that superintendents and the community stakeholders and your school board and your families are the ones who are most capable of making the best policy decisions for your own school districts. And so we would never advise school districts to do one thing or another. We're just providing all the different options and considerations that districts should be thinking about moving forward as they prepare to navigate these changes. So with that, I wanted to start with kind of just the basics, and that is a few different things. So the biggest update here was the rescission of the protected areas designation. And that was something that started back in 2011. The Department of Homeland Security said that it started with what was called sensitive locations. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but basically it was the idea that some community services are so essential that families should know that they're safe to go to regardless of their documentation status. And so that included churches, hospitals, schools, and those kind of various kind of essential community services. In 2021, Secretary Mayorkas under the Biden administration expanded that sensitive locations to what he called protected areas, which was really just like a legal change, but basically saying like to the extent possible, unless there are exigent circumstances, which means that someone's in imminent danger or there's an extreme circumstance, that ICE enforcement, immigration enforcement should not be having or conducting any activities on these properties. And that had been in place since 2021. And then last week, 2 weeks ago, I'm losing track of time at this point, if I'm being honest, but it feels like it's been, 4 months into the year so far. But recently, the Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration has rescinded that designation. So it's not inevitable that ICE agents will show up on your school grounds, but now the possibility exists, which means that now school districts, superintendents, education leaders have to prepare for this possibility. So that's kind of what the majority of my presentation is going to talk about. It's kind of what to know, what to think about, different things to think through as you prepare for this. But two key things that are still in place that I want you to be aware of, as you most likely know, is that Plyler and FERPA are still in place. And so Plyler is the 1982 Supreme Court decision that decided that all students, regardless of immigration status or the immigration status of their parents, have a right to a free public education. That is still in place. There's some movements to challenge it, but right now that is still in place, and that is still the responsibility of school districts to educate everyone. And then, as you all are very aware of, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, protects student data. And, I know that this is something that you're constantly dealing with, so you're very aware, but those are two protections that students still have that are still in place. So as we think about immigration enforcement and kind of some key places, there's some things that school districts must and cannot do. And then there's a lot in between, which is where superintendents have some discretion to think through how they want to deal with ICE agents potentially coming to their school grounds. And it really hones in on this idea of the difference between a judicial and administrative warrant in terms of what schools have and have not and don't have to do. And so one of those, a judicial warrant is issued by a judge. It has a very specific action entitled to it. So interviewing someone, searching something, there's a certain amount of time to which it's confined. But really it's a legal document signed by a court. It's a court order that school districts cannot ignore. You cannot, like, someone can't show up with a judicial warrant and you just say, like, no, can't come, sorry. There would be legal consequences to that, right? And so that's, I think, something that you're probably already familiar with in, other situations potentially. But then there's an administrative warrant, and those are warrants that are issued by an ICE officer or someone else at the Department of Homeland Security, and that's not a judge. And administrative warrants don't have nearly as much legal backing or requirements for schools. So really, if someone shows up with an administrative warrant, school districts and schools have the ability to deny permission to access the private property of the school district. And so that's really where school districts are going to have to make decisions of how they want to interact when ICE agents show up with maybe just an administrative warrant, not a judicial warrant. So this is kind of just reiterates exactly what I was saying, but basically I think the key things here are, and what we've continued to recommend to superintendents and education leaders, is put a policy in place. First of all, figure out how you want to interact with immigration agents. If you only want to allow access when you absolutely have to, when there's a judicial warrant, you can do that. If you decide that you want to cooperate in a different way with just an administrative warrant and work with ICE agents in your district, if that aligns with your district policies, you can also do that. But really the key is develop a policy and then train your staff so they know what to do, because it's likely going to be your front desk staff who's dealing with these potential visitors in the way that they deal with all visitors, right? And there's also some protections when it comes to FERPA as well, in terms of requests for from ICE, and I'll get to that in a second. But here's just some of the key questions that I think you need to consider as you think through your policy. And this policy, may be as easy as like a protocol that you share with your front staff, or it may be a policy, a resolution that you develop with your school board and you pass it in a different way. So some questions to think about, like I said, is, does the district want to cooperate with agents if just presented with an administrative warrant, right? Your legal obligation is you have to cooperate if they bring a judicial warrant, but you have a little bit more discretion with an administrative warrant. Do you want to Do you want to put out a policy saying you are only going to allow access in the case of a judicial warrant? And if you have that policy, do you want to make it public? Do you want to show to your families and your community that they are safe at schools, right? It's just another messaging tool, but that also obviously comes with a lot of political implications given the controversial nature of this issue. That's another thing to think about. And then one of the key things I think here is also who should be the point of contact to handle these situations. If ICE agents show up at your front desk, who should that person call? You likely don't want your front desk staff who's dealing with a lot of other things to also have to figure out the difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. And so a lot of the policies that I've seen is there's a designated point of contact that whoever is dealing with the immigration officer would then call that point of contact and just ask them to wait. So here, I think I have, yeah. So here's a very simple policy that you can put in place, and this is something that you would share with your front desk staff. And it's very much just, welcome the agent, obviously, ask for identification, and then inform whoever that point of contact would be to have them come to the front desk, make copies of the paperwork. That's when you would figure out kind of where is it an administrative warrant? Is it a judicial warrant? Kind of what are the legal requirements? And then just have them wait until the point of contact gets there. I think especially in a rural area where a superintendent may be 2 hours away, maybe it's not advised for the superintendent to be the point of contact. Maybe it is the principal. It really just depends on your specific context and what you think is best. And then something that I think is really important as we start to prepare for the potential of things happening is just keeping notes of these types of requests in these instances in the way that I think you would document any other, interaction with law enforcement. That's just something to keep in mind. I see a lot of things in the chat. Has there been a question yet? I just
No, you covered it. It was, were there any sample policies that could be used as a start as far as things that they could tailor for their own districts? And so you answered that question. And then we will be sending out a recording along with the information that Tara's providing so that you have that for your use moving forward.
Okay, just making sure. Thank you. And I'll get to, we have some other policies as well on our website that I can share, which is a little bit more, depending on where you want to fall on the issue. There are, certain resolutions from like New York City and Massachusetts has a policy in place where they've passed resolutions saying that schools are safe zones. We will not cooperate with ICE, kind of the things you've seen from more larger progressive districts. So like Denver, Beaverton, those big districts. And so if that's something also kind of the stance you want to take, and you can take that as well. And so those are all things that I can share and that I link to at the end of the presentation. So that's kind of the policy. I will say the other key, I get a question all the time about like what does a judicial warrant look like versus administrative warrant. You can provide all of that information to your staff, but once again, I think it's probably best to have just like one person who's well versed on this, so you don't have different staffers trying to figure out what the legal documentation is. But from my understanding, the top of the document, if it's a judicial warrant, will like list the court from which it comes from, versus an administrative warrant would just say like the Department of Homeland Security. So FERPA and law enforcement, this is something I really want to talk about because I think, we're still waiting to see if ICE agents use the authority that they've now been granted to go to schools. I think that's going to remain to be seen, and it's something we're watching closely. But something we think that could absolutely happen is they may not come to schools to interview a student, to detain a student, but they may come looking for information. And that is where schools need to be really, really thoughtful about this moving forward because of the protections of FERPA. So law enforcement can request data that is protected by FERPA for, through different processes. And so some things to think about if a law enforcement officer comes and requests data is one, always, right? Consult with your legal counsel. That's something you're most likely going to do to determine your obligations, because depending on the process, once again, that determines whether or not you have to give certain data. If it's covered by FERPA and it's an informal request, then you would not be legally required to provide that information. if they show up with a subpoena, you'd obviously have to provide that information. So that's something to think about, but you also want to make sure that it's closely aligned with, but you also want to make sure that the amount of data and the types of data you collect are specifically aligned with the programs that you have. So basically the recommendations that I've heard, and this is more broadly, this isn't just in relation to immigration enforcement, is so FERPA doesn't have any limits on the type of data you can collect, except for like social security numbers and a few things. It just mainly has a lot of limits on what you can share. And so the recommendation is often to schools, it's like make sure all of the data that you are collecting is data that you need. Because the more data you're hanging around, the more data you may have to give out. And that's just like more of a headache for you and having to deal with FERPA and other things, right? So just make sure that all the data you're collecting is something that you're obligated to collect, either based on your state or your district, or information that you absolutely need. But if you don't need it, then don't collect it. And if you do collect it, don't store it for longer than you need it. So those are kind of two key things to think about. More broadly, FERPA prohibits schools from disclosing student records, right, without without the certain processes. And then, as you all know, there's exceptions. So there's like the directory information is available, but even with directory information, you have to be careful to make sure that it's not indirectly providing information that would be protected. So a good example that was brought to my attention was a school, usually has to obtain parental consent before disclosing a list of names and phone numbers of all the students who are English language learners, because although all of that information is directory information, by pulling that like sub list would implicitly provide information that is protected. And so that's why I think getting in the habit of understanding I think understanding like the full protections of FERPA, making sure your staff understand the full protections is going to be really important moving forward, because like your front desk staff may not be fully versed on what is and is not covered, and they may think like, oh, well, it's just directory data, so it's protected. But really, if it's like a subgroup, then that could be implicitly student data that is protected by FERPA and should not be given out, and would also need parental consent.
Tara, there's a comment from Julie Shu. She says
Mhm.
that her son's school in Denver got an ICE warrant asking for the guardianship records for every student in the school, and it was this week. Have you been hearing things like that from other districts in the country?
I have not. We're still trying to collect this information, and so I will put out the request right now that if like instances like this, we want to document, make sure that the school district has documentation, but I would really like to have this information to have an idea of like what school districts are actually dealing with. So thank you for sharing that, Julie. These are the types of things that we think is going to happen. It's a little bit less newsworthy, unfortunately, right? If they're just asking for data, but could still have really drastic consequences. And and not to mention it's a significant burden on the district to have to pull all that information and figure out, where they're in line. So that is the first I've heard of it, but that was something that we thought could be a potential action. So aside from kind of the legal protections, figuring out your policy with how you want to deal with ICE enforcement, there's also this other piece, which is especially when you're talking about rural education, it's that rural schools are often the community center, you're the community hub. Families often look to you for resources and guidance on many different things. And so, how do you communicate with your families to make sure that they feel safe, that they're still sending their kids to school? Something we've continued to hear from members is that kids are scared to go to school because they're scared that they're going to get home and their parents aren't going to be there, or they're scared now that they're going to be detained at school, and so it's no longer a safe space that they can go. And so I think these are real concerns, and this is another part of an education leader's responsibility is dealing with that. And so there are some pieces that we've seen that can be helpful. One is kind of that broad statement, if it works for you and your school board, is like putting out a policy and making sure your families are informed of the policy, that you will not interact with ICE enforcement unless absolutely required, right? Which is like that like judicial warrant bar. we've seen that in a few places as a way to kind of reassure families to make sure they understand kind of what the school district's policies are. I think communicating the policies in general is probably really helpful just so families kind of have an idea because they're seeing things in the news all day, every day, and I think they're really concerned. And so just understanding kind of how districts are going to be dealing with this, I think will be really helpful to them. And the other piece, if you don't, because I understand that, not cooperating with law enforcement could also be something that could be misconstrued if you put out a resolution like that. And so the other options you have is just making sure that families understand that they still have those protections under PLILA and FERPA, making sure that they understand their legal protections that are already in place. And that just could just be a reminder to them of like, this is still like you are still and your child is still entitled to a free education. They still belong here. They're still safe. And these are all of the data that is safe as well. Because I think, especially when it comes to FERPA, parents have no idea, right? I just learned about this a year and a half ago. And so I think also just reassuring to families kind of what the existing protections are in can also be really helpful.
Tara, I have a question from Leanne Wilson.
Yes.
What happens when the judicial warrant backs up into FERPA protections in a school?
So that's definitely when you would have to go to your legal counsel and make sure that everything you're pulling would be very specific to the warrant. So a judicial warrant would fall under that subpoena category where they've gone through the accurate channels and to legally request this information. And so it's not that you can never give information to law enforcement. They just have to go through the proper channels and prove that they absolutely need this information, which is how they got the judicial warrant to begin with. But as always, you're going to want to talk to legal counsel to make sure that you're in line with FERPA and really making sure that you're only giving the exact information that is required in the judicial warrant. I have, and I linked to it later. There's a really great document, and it's the source that I just linked to. It's from someone that we work with closely, Amelia Vance. She's kind of like the leading expert on student privacy and FERPA within education. And she put that together, and that whole document really talks about what schools should be thinking about as they deal with law enforcement when it comes to student data. So the last piece that I wanted to cover is thinking through still continuing to engage with families, but maybe in a different way, where this is something that they are very scared of as they continue to see mass deportation actions happening on school, off schools, or potentially happening in schools, but happening elsewhere. And so things that they need to think about, and things that you likely have to think about if, for instance, right, a student were to go home and their parents were not there. And so some things to think about, these are all links, is creating a family preparedness plan. So if something were to happen to the parent, what happens to the student? These are things you have to think about in other scenarios, right? This isn't the first time you're having to think about who an emergency contact is, but making sure that that information is up to date is something that you'll want to be aware of. And then these are other documents. If you want to provide them to your families, you can. There's a whole handbook from the Department of Homeland Security around this, as well as certain paperwork. And it depends on what state you're in, what kind of paperwork you need, but to delegate parental responsibilities if something were to happen to them. And then at the very bottom are some resources around just know your rights, those red cards that you all have seen, just so parents know what to do if they were to encounter ICE. Once again, I understand these are not resources that all of you are going to be sharing out with your families. I'm just providing all the resources that I have to share with you. So here's actually a really great checklist. So we have a whole toolkit now on our website that I know Melissa linked to initially before this meeting. So I just wanted to go through some of the key resources that we have that I think are really helpful. This is a checklist that was put together by a superintendent that I work with who does this work often, and she kind of just flagged things that I think from a superintendent's brain makes a little bit more sense. So one, like I said earlier, establish a protocol on how you're going to deal with ICE. That's going to be kind of the first step in all of this. You have to figure out what you do and do not want to do. How that is publicized to your community also has to deal with your policies that are in place, but just develop a policy and a protocol so staff know what to do. Because one, I'm sure you're getting a lot of questions, but two, they need to know because, like I said, you're probably not going to be at every school when this happens. And then you're going to want to provide the training on that protocol to to your staff. So on the policy protocol as well as FERPA, you may want to have them brush up on their FERPA trainings. I don't know the last one that they had. I think that's a really good idea because I like Julia stated earlier, I think that's going to be a tool that ICE uses moving forward is getting data from schools. So you want to make sure that everyone understands kind of what the protections of FERPA are. And then the third thing that's been flagged for us is if you're in a sanctuary state, that means a certain thing. And so there are certain trainings and resources that you can provide to your staff so they understand what a sanctuary state means and what that means for a school district. And we link to all of those on our website. We have the Oregon sanctuary state resources available, but it's just kind of an example. And then a lot of it is kind of just talking about the paperwork that I provided you a slide ago with how to engage with families, things that they should think through, kind of creating this preparedness plan, what would happen to their students if something were to happen. Often some of the paperwork needs to be notarized. And so something that I've heard from some superintendents is they provide free notary services in the community to those families. So that's something that schools could think about or at least provide the information to families. And then the last one is to build relationships with community-based organizations. This is something I know a lot of school districts you already have in place. Once again, especially rural education, you're very closely tied with your community and the supports that you have, but there also may not be as many supports there. So just kind of identifying who you can work with in your area to support students if something were to happen. And then in some instances, I've seen where then they provide staff with the contact information for the community-based organizations to make sure that students get the supports that they need.
Tara, I have a question.
Mhm.
Dr. Sampath Daniel, how does one identify a fake ICE agent? Is that something that potentially you have encountered as well?
Oh, that is not something that has been flagged for me at all. I don't know how to identify, what an ICE officer looks like, and I think that's when it comes down to the paperwork, because even at minimum they would have an administrative warrant, right? So they would still have documentation from the Department of Homeland Security. But once again, I think it goes down to like what paperwork do you have? The identification, I think, is key. That was kind of in that protocol that I referenced earlier. The first is like ask for identification, and yeah, that's a good point. Then maybe some people are impersonating ICE. I haven't heard of those stories, so uh, that would be very interesting. But yeah, I would say at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the paperwork that they have, how you want to deal with it. But you're always going to need to check for the paperwork. And I think the same way you would, right? If a police officer comes to campus or anyone else, I don't think it's that different from these others. So the other resource I wanted to flag, and this is something that can be downloaded directly from our website. It is for all superintendents, everyone who wants it. It's not behind the paywall or not behind the member wall. And this is a pretty comprehensive FAQ on on various questions that we've gotten either since the protected areas designation was taken away or from the webinar that we had back on January 15th. So it's pretty comprehensive. I have the 3 sections listed here. It has a lot of the same information that was in the blog post that I had authored that Melissa shared ahead of this call, but with even more questions. So there's questions like, what do I do if an ICE agent is talking to a student on school grounds, but it's a public event, right? There's kind of the different things that I think a lot of staff specifically are very curious about. What if, an ICE agent is talking to a student at a bus stop, which is technically public property, right? Like what can you do then? It goes a lot as well into where parental consent needs to be obtained, right? So that also has to do with the administrative warrant piece. So if you decide to cooperate with ICE, even with just administrative warrants, then parental consent needs to come into play. So these are all things you'll have to think through. And so I mean, I'm biased because I made the document, but I think it's a really great resource that you can download, you can share with your staff, but you can also go through and think through like, okay, what am I not thinking about here? If as you start to make a plan for your area. Some other resources is the webinar recording. We do have communication templates for AASA members that can really help school districts kind of just provide at least a like to get started on how to communicate to families. So there's, communications to staff, families based on different scenarios. So like if ICE were to show up at your school, how do you then communicate that to your district? How do you communicate to them just in terms of the uncertainty of everything that's happening, right? All kind of many different templates for different scenarios that I think can be really helpful. And then we have a ton of external resources. Those are available to everyone on the toolkit. And that is, it varies from AFT's resources all the way to the Department of Justice kind of outlining what the current protections are. And so I definitely recommend checking those out for not just you, but also if there's resources that your staff's asking for or the families in your area are asking for. I think that can all be really helpful. And that is it. I feel like I talked fast. I realized once I stopped that I didn't have my clock. So okay, but I wanted to provide enough time for questions and kind of talk through any big questions that you all have.
So please feel free to either unmute and raise your digital hand so we can call on you, or you, if you would rather not do that, can certainly put it in the chat. We're monitoring that. So we're happy to ensure that you are able to ask your question through that. Dave Ardrey, who is our interim executive director for NREA. Dave, I'm going to give you the floor first.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Tara, Dave Ardrey. Sorry, I'm traveling today in a car. So thank you so much for taking time to be a part of this and share your information. I do have one question. I was listening to the conversation about, the fake ID or the fake ICE or any concern, honestly. I may have missed this in the first few minutes. Can your school resource officer be a very significant part of this conversation, given you may have one on site?
Um, Yes and no. I think it depends on the SRO's training, frankly. I know that they don't even have the same training as other police officers, so it's a little different. And they're really not as I think they're not really trained, right, to identify the difference between administrative warrant, judicial warrant, understanding ICE and doing the ID. Maybe they could do kind of the first screening. I think it just depends um on the individual and what they feel comfortable doing as well. Once again, I always say like start with a real lawyer, ask them, and then go from there. If you wanted to do the training and designate your SRO as your point of contact, that's within your rights to do that. But then you have to think about what happens if there's another incident that SROs need to. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking as really in Illinois, the majority of our SROs are law enforcement contracted from either
Mhm.
state or county or local agencies. So they are trained, they are fully trained officers, and they might be a nice excuse me, a nice front line to be able to be the first point of contact. Introduce yourself to me because I am law enforcement on this site and you can produce your IDs. So maybe just a front line support, maybe not so much on the legal, but definitely as you're not coming in the building until I'm fully comfortable because that's their job. Their job is to protect the building, the students, the teachers. And
Yeah, that's a great point.
Thanks, Dave.
yeah, Tara, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Other questions around this particular issue? And if there aren't, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would follow up on Dave's piece. If you don't have an SRO, then the building principal, or in our case, vocational technical director, uh, the ID, I would ask for an ID and a telephone number to their boss and have them stand tall in the administrative office and not allow them into the building any further until all of that was satisfied. And you copied all of that. It's, so, I mean, we do have some rights. And students obviously carried in an outstanding job on that presentation. And I would certainly say every school district ought to have a plan if they don't have it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. That should be the key takeaway is just have a plan. Whatever you want your plan to be, just have a plan and a policy in place and make sure that's communicated to your staff.
And Julie Shu noted that their policy has been not to let them in the building at all.
There you go.
Any other questions around this topic? Tara, I'm going to open it up a little bit broader now that we've had this part of the conversation and just ask you to give us kind of an update on what's happening with the Department of Ed. And if there are other questions that people have, please feel free to let us know that as well.
Yeah, I can give like a quick update, but I do want to make sure that people ask whatever questions may be on their mind. I think probably the thing that everyone's seen and is top of mind is the much anticipated executive order around the Department of Education. So first I want to start with, even if the Department of Education is eliminated, that does not mean that your federal funding would be. Title I existed before the Department of Ed. It will exist after the Department of Ed. It would just move to a different department. And so that's something I just want to flag for everyone. I don't want anyone to panic that their federal funding is going to be taken away, even if the department goes away. I think right now the plan that I've seen is the rural REAP would go to Treasury, I think, and so they would just be sending out payments. Title IDEA would go to HHS, Health and Human Services. So they would just divvy it up among the other departments. Your funding would be okay. The second piece is that only Congress can eliminate a department that it has created. And so what we understand from this executive order is going to have two pieces. One is going to be asking the department to figure out how to dismantle itself, right? How to get rid of basically everything within the department that has not been created by Congress. So pretty much everything in its legal authority that it can get rid of. So all the discretionary grants, any of the people that aren't absolutely necessary, that kind of thing. And then the second part is asking Congress to officially eliminate the Department of Education. That, like I said, will require Congress. It cannot be done through reconciliation, so they cannot do it with a simple majority in the Senate. They need 60 votes in the Senate to eliminate the department, and right now they do not have 60 votes. To get to 60 votes, they would need 6 Democrats, and eliminating the department is not something that any Democrat right now wants a headline on or is going to get behind. So you can rest easy a little bit that the Department of Education is okay. I think the bigger piece, and that's really what we're seeing in other agencies, is what they can do to dismantle it from within. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of the technical assistance that you rely on may not be as available. There's going to be less people there dealing with discretionary grants and competitive grants, which frankly, I know isn't very relevant to a lot of rural school districts because they're difficult to get anyway. So I would say that's the piece that we're watching is how much staff is going to get eliminated. What does that mean for supports to school districts? Because at the end of the day, they're not going to get rid of the people who are collecting all the data from you. They're going to get rid of the people who are providing supports for you. And so that's kind of what we're watching. This doesn't mean that you're going to get any less civil rights data collection requirements. Like that, those are going to come in full force. So that's not going to change, right? So we're kind of watching to see how they eliminate it. We do have Secretary McMahon's confirmation hearing, I think it's next week. It keeps getting delayed because of some paperwork. And so we're waiting for that. There's been some back and forth on whether or not that executive order will come out after her confirmation so she doesn't have to deal with all of these questions. we're kind of waiting and seeing. I don't even think they really know when they're going to put it out, but that's kind of what we're waiting on. We have been told that once she is confirmed, she plans to eliminate at least 50% of the civil servants at the Department of Ed. So those are the real things that we're watching, because at the end of the day, we know that that the department cannot be, I mean, it can be eliminated, but Congress doesn't have the political will to do it at this time.
Uh, Helio Brazil, do you want to just unmute and make your comments?
Sure, it's kind of long, but this was something that was developed and shared with me here in California by capital advisors who do quite a bit of advocacy for smalls and rurals.
Mhm.
I thought it was very well stated in terms of, and just hearing the past discussion, that really the will of Congress and Democrats I don't believe would impact, or that anyone is going to put their neck out on the line for this. However, that being said, we never thought we'd be where we are today. So I just thought that this was kind of interesting, and it's not one single document. I just kind of took some things out and shared for the good of the whole. So thank you.
Thanks, Helio. There's a question. Can the executive order affect multilingual learner department funding or grants?
The executive order cannot.
Tara, I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Mm-mm.
So can
No, it's very, very faint.
you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. When in doubt, just rip the headphones out. So the executive order would not, because that's a grant that's been created by Congress. And so any grants, from my understanding of currently what's legally possible, right? I think we are in a place where we don't know, and at the end of the day, it's kind of like they'll do what they want until it's challenged. So we'll have to see. But right now, legally, the way that everything historically has gone is the executive order cannot get rid of anything that Congress has created, and those grants were created by Congress. Um, all that being said, as we still continue to watch Congress's actions on fiscal year 25. As a reminder, fiscal year 25 started on October 1, and they're still trying to figure that out. We're still under continuing resolution. We know that fiscal year 25 funding is going to be a tough fight for education. And so while the executive order cannot get rid of the multilingual grant, if the president identifies this as something that he considers to be DEI and should no longer exist, then that may give the leadership in the House and Senate kind of some incentive to eliminate that grant. As a reminder, for the last proposal we saw from fiscal year 25 eliminated Title II and Title III, as well as gutted Title I by 25%. So about $4.7 billion. And that was something that we saw, and they said that they were providing such kind of stark numbers because it was a starting point for negotiations against a Democratic Senate. Now that they are in control of both the House and the Senate, I think it'll be interesting to see what new numbers they come out with. Like, are they still going to try to cut Title I by 25%, knowing that they no longer have the cover of saying that this is starting point negotiations? It's really unclear. But I think what we know now is that President Trump has an incredible amount of influence on Congress now. And so if he identifies a program that he doesn't like, he could easily ask Congress to not provide funding for it. And depending on how hard the Democrats want to fight for it, that's going to be kind of, we'll just have to wait and see. But those are kind of all conversations that are happening. The thing to flag, once again, with fiscal year 25 funding, and when we get into fiscal year 26, whenever that happens, is appropriation bills also need 60 votes in the Senate. The Senate always, the the hard stop in Congress. And so they will need 60 votes as well for that. And so anything that they try to get through will have to have some form of bipartisanship to it. And there's also such a small margin in the House. They currently have a margin of 1 in the House. And so seeing how they're going to get to something that could pass in both the House and the Senate is going to be really, it's really tough to see a path forward, frankly. I'm actually starting to hear conversations around there could be a shutdown as we get closer to the March 14th deadline. And if there is a shutdown, I will remind you, Title I, all of those programs are forward funded, so you should have that funding. If you get Impact Aid or Head Start, those are the two programs that are immediately affected um, by a shutdown. And so those are things just to keep in mind. And we'll provide, as we get closer to the March 14th deadline, we'll provide more updates. But that was just some news that I heard this morning, is that they're not making any progress. And so fiscal year 25 is looking quite difficult.
Yeah. And to Jamie Green's point, time for us all to use our voices and not be spectators, my friends. Other questions, comments, anything else that you'd like to ask Tara to weigh in on? All right, Tara, I'm going to give you the last word if there's anything else that you want to bring forward.
No, I would just kind of second what Jamie was saying. I can talk about the impact of federal funding for education all day, but it's really them hearing it directly from their constituents is the only thing that's going to move forward. And honestly, right now in the current context, rural has such a strong voice because of who's in power. And so I strongly encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress, talk about what a cut to Title I would look like. Talk about, Jamie does this all the time, if you get secure rural schools funding, now is the time to talk about that, because it has not been reauthorized and it is very much in jeopardy, as well as all this other education funding. And them having a full understanding of how it impacts the students and the people in their communities will make them hesitate in cutting it. And so please reach out. And if you need any help reaching out, please, I'll put my email in the chat, although I hope most of you already have it at this point. But please reach out. I'm happy to pull email addresses for you for staffers, provide talking points, anything you need to get started on advocacy. This is really the time now. It's more important than ever that superintendents and education leaders really start to advocate.
Agreed. All right. Well, Tara, I want to say thank you on behalf of NREA for your expertise and for taking your time out and being with us here today, and being willing to be a resource moving forward. We greatly appreciate it.
Wait, can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Nope. Absolutely.
Once again, I know I said it before, but if you do hear of instances or it happens specifically in your district, that would be most helpful, of where ICE is showing up. Just an idea of like what data they're asking for. This will continue to help me make sure that superintendents have the resources that they need. So if this starts to happen, please let me know.
That's great. Great point. So please do share those stories. And everybody, thank you for taking time to be with us here today. Please look for future special roundtables from NREA. We want to make sure that we're helping you be the voice for your rural community and giving you the tools to be able to do it effectively. So enjoy the rest of the day and take care.